Hello everyone, welcome to Crypto Whiteboard Tuesday. In today's episode, we are going to be covering what is a consensus mechanism and the two most popular consensus mechanisms out there, which are proof of work and proof of stake. Let's get started. Alright, so before we jump right into the different consensus mechanisms, I want to quickly cover what a consensus mechanism actually is. A consensus mechanism is essentially the method by which nodes agree on the valid state of a distributed ledger. Or to put it simply, a consensus mechanism is how all the computers in a network can agree on what data is stored on the blockchain. So before blockchain technology, centralized institutions like banks would use a central authority to come to an agreement on the validity of transactions. For example, if I wanted to send $100 from my bank account to my friend's bank account, the bank would serve as the central authority to ensure that both myself and my friend had sufficient funds and they execute the transaction accordingly. However, this introduces a single point of failure since the entire network relies on the bank to validate transactions and ensure the security of the network. This is why blockchain technology was created. The blockchain introduced a decentralized peer-to-peer network that allowed users to interact with each other directly without the need for a central authority. But this raises the question, how can these decentralized networks come to an agreement on what transactions should be included on the blockchain? Well, this is where consensus mechanisms come into play. Consensus mechanisms allow all participants to view and validate transactions within the ledger. Each participant comes to an agreement on what transactions should be validated and added to the blockchain. There are several different consensus mechanisms out there. However, today we're going to be focusing on the two most popular mechanisms, proof of work and proof of stake. Let's start with proof of work. Proof of work was the original consensus mechanism used by Bitcoin and is still one of the most popular consensus mechanisms to date. In order to understand how proof of work works, let's take a step back and revisit the mining analogy. In the proof of work algorithm, miners compete against each other to find the correct answer to a difficult math equation. The first miner to correctly solve the equation wins the right to add the next block of transactions to the blockchain and receives a reward for doing so. So, how exactly does this work? Well, let me show you. To understand this process, we need to introduce a few key concepts: hash function, nonce, and difficulty target. So the hash function is essentially a formula or algorithm that generates a unique string of characters called a hash value based on the input provided. In this case, the input for the hash function will be the block header, which contains information such as the timestamp, previous block hash, and other relevant data. Now the goal is to modify the data in the block header until the resulting hash value meets the difficulty target set by the network. And this is where the nonces come into play. So the nonce is a variable that the miners can adjust to modify the data in the block header. Now here's the catch. The hash value must satisfy certain conditions in order to be considered valid. For example, it might need to start with a certain number of zeros or fall within a specific range. This is the difficulty target, which is set based on the current difficulty of the network. And this difficulty level is regularly adjusted to ensure that the block creation remains challenging but not impossible. So let me walk you through an example to show you how this all fits together. Let's say the current block that needs to be validated contains transactions between Alice and Bob. The miner will include this data in the block header along with a random starting nonce. Then they'll run the hash function to generate a hash value. If the hash value meets the difficulty target, then the miner has successfully validated the block and added it to the blockchain. They'll receive a reward for their work, which typically consists of newly minted coins and transaction fees. This process continues with each new block building on the previous one and forming a chain of blocks, which is the blockchain. And that's a brief overview of how proof of work algorithms work. In the next section, we'll discuss the advantages and disadvantages of proof of work. First, let's look at the advantages. One of the main advantages of proof of work is its robustness and security. Attacking or manipulating the blockchain requires an attacker to control a significant portion of the network's hashing power. This makes it extremely costly and practically infeasible for any malicious actors to compromise the network. Another advantage of proof of work is its simplicity. The concept is relatively easy to understand and has been battle-tested over the years. Additionally, proof of work is a decentralized process, which means no single entity has control over the network. However, there are also some disadvantages to proof of work. The biggest drawback is its energy consumption. As the network grows and becomes more secure, the computational power required to validate blocks increases exponentially. This leads to higher energy consumption and increased costs for miners, not to mention the carbon footprint associated with burning fossil fuels to power these mining operations. Another disadvantage is the potential for centralization due to the high upfront investment required for mining equipment. Overall, proof of work is a revolutionary concept that has stood the test of time, and it will likely remain a prominent consensus mechanism in the future. Now let's move on to proof of stake. Proof of stake is a newer consensus mechanism that has gained popularity in recent years. Unlike proof of work, proof of stake does not rely on computational power but rather on the amount of cryptocurrency that a user is willing to stake or lock up in order to participate in the validation process. In a proof-of-stake network, users who wish to validate blocks are required to hold and stake a certain amount of coins. The larger the stake, the higher the likelihood of being selected to validate blocks. In fact, the selection process is often compared to a lottery where the more tickets you buy, the better your chances of winning. But there's more to proof-of-stake than just holding a large amount of coins. Stakers must also meet certain requirements to ensure the security and integrity of the network. For example, they may need to have a minimum amount of coins staked or be part of a designated pool of validators. Additionally, stakers must adhere to specific rules and guidelines to prevent malicious behavior and ensure fairness. One of the primary advantages of proof of stake is its energy efficiency. Since there is no need for expensive mining hardware or the computational power required for proof of work, the energy consumption is significantly reduced. In fact, proof of stake consumes up to 99% less energy than proof of work. This makes it a much more environmentally friendly option for running a blockchain network. Another advantage of proof of stake is its scalability. Unlike proof of work, which can only process a limited number of transactions per second, proof-of-stake networks can handle a much higher volume of transactions. This makes it a more attractive option for applications that require a high degree of scalability. However, proof-of-stake also has its disadvantages. One of the main concerns with proof-of-stake is the potential for centralization. Since the cost of entry is much lower than proof of work, a small group of wealthy individuals could easily control a majority of the network's coins and influence the validation process. This could lead to a loss of decentralization and undermine the security of the network. Another concern is the risk of double spending. Since validators are selected based on the amount of coins they have staked, there is a potential for double spending attacks. This means that an attacker could potentially spend the same coins multiple times without being detected. Overall, proof of stake is a promising consensus mechanism that offers several advantages over proof of work. While there are some concerns about its security and fairness, these issues can be mitigated with proper implementation and regulation. As we wrap up this lesson, I want to leave you with some food for thought. Which consensus mechanism do you think is better? Why? And what are the implications for the future of cryptocurrencies? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this lesson and learned something new. If you did, please hit the like button and subscribe for more weekly lessons on blockchain technology. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.